Mr. Rao, we're celebrating NATO's 70th birthday. Is there much to celebrate?
Well, NATO, despite its problems today, still is the most successful alliance in really world history, one could say. And I do think there's a lot that binds us together. The end of the counter-ISIS campaign in Syria, I think, is an accomplishment for the West that we can be very proud of. There's still a lot of challenges on the horizon. But I do think that Europe and the United States being able to trade, gain prosperity, work together on diplomatic issues, a lot of that is because of, and thanks to the backbone of NATO. So I do think that it's a moment for celebration, although we shouldn't lose the impetus for reform.
Yeah, but does it still have a common purpose, like it had during the Cold War?
Well, there is still the problem of Russian intervention in Europe. Russia is the only power that has redrawn Western European boundaries since the end of the Cold War by force through the annexation of Crimea, its active intervention in Ukraine. It's also, people forget, still meddling in Georgia, where there's a frozen conflict of sorts, and even in Moldova. So I do think that there are issues in Europe where hard power, military deterrence is necessary. And in fact, we've seen within NATO over the past 4 or 5 years a flip from out-of-area operations, NATO deploying beyond the continent, back to territorial defense of NATO members from the Baltics all the way down to the Black Sea. That is still the mission of NATO. That is still its essential purpose. And without military power, without military force, it's impossible to deter revisionist actors like Russia.
Your colleague, Walter Russell Mead, recently wrote, NATO is dying. What did he mean by that?
I think he meant that there is a divergence within Europe, between different parts of Europe, on what military power actually means, whether or not it's still necessary. I do think that, for example, Spain has a very different attitude toward the world than, say, the Baltic countries. Eastern Europe tends to look east towards Russia. Southern Europe tends to look toward the Mediterranean. Germany, in between, I think, has its own attitudes. And so because there are different points of views and perspectives, it's very hard to organize, to build a coalition, to have a common purpose. And then, of course, there is the major issue which the president and the administration keeps hammering on, and that is Europe's real malpractice on investments in military defense. You have to be able to have capabilities in order to have a military alliance. And it's hard for people like myself, who are supporters of the Transatlantic Alliance, to travel across the Midwest, where I'm originally from, and make the argument for American soldiers deploying American investments in hardware when we have roads that need their potholes filled, when we have other investments in education and healthcare, because the Europeans aren't carrying their fair share. So I do think that's a big problem, and long term, it's not sustainable politically.
Would you say it's less unified than it ever was, NATO?
I just think the world is changing. I mean, we're exiting the post-Cold War era. There are new challenges on the horizon. America is pivoting towards the Asia-Pacific. This will be the first time in 400 or 500 years that Europe is not the cockpit of world affairs, that the future, the next decades of the 21st century won't be decided in Europe. They will most likely be decided in the Asia-Pacific. And so I think as America's attitudes shift towards a different part of the world, and Europe is still focused on Europe, and in particular on trade with China, you could have different perspectives and different points of views come up. I don't think it's so much the president. I don't think it's so much Angela Merkel in Berlin or Emmanuel Macron in Paris or Theresa May for however long she remains prime minister in Great Britain. I really think it is structural trends in global affairs that are really causing the alliances some difficulty today.
But let's for one moment zoom in on those individuals like President Trump.
Sure.
He's so doubted about NATO. He called it obsolete at one point. He doubted Article 5. To what extent does he play a part in all of this, that NATO is not as unified as it used to be?
Well, I think that is the superpower's dilemma. On the one hand, we want to encourage our partners to spend more, but there's no real incentive to spend so long as you know that the United States is going to defend Europe at all costs. And so by raising some doubts about American commitments, I think he's trying to nudge, cajole, badger the Europeans into doing more. There are risks there, of course, that our adversaries might interpret that as weakness, that Article 5 is no longer operational. But then on the other hand, he's given strong speeches, for example, in Warsaw, where he underscored the importance of Article 5. So I think there have been some mixed messages out of the White House. That is a dangerous game. But in his analysis, what options do the United States have? We tried a different track under President Obama. We tried a different track under President George W. Bush. Defense secretaries and presidents have made the argument for more defense spending, and Europe really hasn't responded. So now he thinks through blunt force, maybe he'll be able to accomplish and achieve more. In his defense, I would also say that while his rhetoric has been, at times, on Article 5, a little bit shaky, I guess one could say, the investments the Americans have made in the frontiers of Europe, in Eastern Europe, have really been impressive. There's been an increase of something like 40 or 50% in enhanced forward presence, which is the rotations in Eastern Europe. We've led a battalion in the Baltic states. We've rallied Europe on sanctions in the wake of Ukraine, and the Americans have stood strong by that. So I do think there are arguments to be made. The pushing of Javelin missile systems to Ukraine, which I think is a pretty strong statement in support of Kiev. It is a mixed bag in some sense, but I think actions count more than words, and without some words, there's no way of pushing the Europeans.
But isn't there a risk to his rhetoric that, especially a lot of the big European allies think, well, we can't rely on the United States as much anymore?
There is a risk, and there's also a risk that if you just allow things to proceed along the status quo, that those people I mentioned earlier in the Midwest will eventually say, well, we're carrying 70 or 80% of the military capabilities, even though Europe is just as prosperous as the United States, and why should we continue in this alliance if we don't have support from our European partners? I think that's basically the attempt of the Trump administration to break out of the traditional framework and make that argument.
Is it working?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know if it's President Trump or whether or not it's the Russian belligerents in Eastern Europe that's causing the increase in defense spending. But since the intervention, or both, but since the intervention in Ukraine, Europe has added something like $50 billion in defense expenditures. That is like adding the entire military defense budget of Great Britain to the NATO alliance since 2014, 2015. That's a very good result. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, keeps emphasizing that it's the president. The president likes hearing that and has used it for his domestic political purposes. Doesn't matter where it comes from. I think it's just a good thing that we're investing more in defense.
Yeah. Well, let's shift the focus to the European allies, especially the role Germany's playing. One of the most important NATO partners. That's one of those countries that's not willing to increase their defense budget. To what extent are they to blame for this friction in NATO?
Well, there's an American expression that talk is cheap. I think the Europeans, but especially Germany, likes to offer all sorts of rosy rhetoric about the importance of NATO, but their actions really haven't tracked it, and that's been very disappointing for the United States. There is no more important power in Europe than Germany. It really is the regional actor now that really shapes, and in some respects even dominates events on the continent, and for it to really engage in military malpractice by decreasing its defense budget, unwilling to meet its commitments it made at Wales to reach 2% by 2024. Now it won't even projected to reach 1.5% by 2024. I think that's really unfortunate. And it also offers an excuse for countries around Germany, like the Netherlands, not to meet its defense spending obligations. Why should they do it if the Germans don't? And I think that's partially why President Trump and Germany in particular have had such a rough and shaky ride over the past 2 years.
Yeah. In the past, the Soviet Union was the clear enemy for Germany, now is increasingly becoming a partner as well. Is this pulling apart NATO, that we have these diverging interests?
I think so. I do think that during the Cold War, the Russians were stationed not only on Western Europe's borders, but in Germany's modern-day capital of Berlin. And so it was very easy to rally and to really tie together and weld together American policymaking with German policymaking. Today, the German attitude, especially the junior coalition partner, the Social Democrats in Berlin, is that we need more engagement, more outreach. We need to try to weave together Russian actions and German policy to the extent possible. And there's a new factor, the rise of these right-wing populist groups that have a lot of affinity for Russia. So if you add all of these currents together, there is a huge voter bloc in Germany, and politicians are responding that are interested in a new policy toward Russia. I do think that one factor that is really important to keep in mind. Nationalism in a lot of ways is attractive to Americans because we ourselves are very nationalistic. But there's a danger for nationalism to become provincial, which is to say there still is an order in Europe. There still are allied responsibilities. And when you have players like Matteo Salvini in Italy accepting Chinese money, or the AfD in Germany attracted to Russian money and to Russian policies, you have to think larger than your immediate responsibilities, larger than your nation, so to speak, if you're part of an alliance framework. And I think that is worrying for a lot of Americans.
Yeah. Another diverging power is Turkey, one of the biggest NATO members in terms of military personnel. They seem to getting closer with Russia as well. To what extent is that a threat to the alliance?
I do think that the Turkish-Russian relationship is a huge problem for the United States. The Turks have announced, and they seem to be intent on carrying this out, the purchase of the S-400 missile system from Russia. This poses a huge threat to the F-35, which is, of course, the new fighter jet the United States is developing, because there are like two modern computer programs, if you link them together, I think a lot of the F-35 capabilities could be transferred to Russia, and a lot of weaknesses and other problems could be identified. So there are big problems. But I would also say that the United States isn't exactly half guilty when it comes to the deterioration in relations with Turkey. We have in northern Syria, through the counter-ISIS campaign, empowered the Syrian cousins of the PKK in Turkey, the YPG. These are considered terrorists not only by the United States' own definition, but also by the Europeans and, of course, by the Turks. So it would be the equivalent of our NATO partners in Europe working in Mexico to build up, say, al-Qaeda on the American border. We would be incensed by it. The Turks are. I do think the United States has some blame and some share of the blame here in the deterioration in relations. I'm not here to be an apologist for Erdogan, but no Turkish leader, irrespective who would be sitting in power in Ankara, would be able to handle this or would be able to look askance as the United States does and acts in these sorts of directions. So I think the Turkish-American relationship and the Turkish-European relationship is complex, but I think also the United States is to blame here.
But that was the great dilemma for the Americans, because the Kurdish YPG militia were crucial in their fight against ISIS.
And that is the lesson of not only the election of Donald Trump, but also Barack Obama. They decided to pull back from the Middle East. And if you're going to pull back, you need a partner to be able to take on ISIS on the ground. And the only partner that immediately raised its hand was PKK, YPG. So we're able to defeat ISIS on the ground, but in the process, we empowered YPG to build Rojava, this kind of autonomous bloc across northern Syria. We've essentially lined the Turkish border with a hostile force blocking Turkey's access to the Middle East, and for the Turks, that's unacceptable.
Yeah. So do you argue Americans should have more boots on the ground in Syria?
That's what I would have advocated for, but that's politically, I think, very difficult these days for the United States to push. And then, of course, the other big question, the other big element that matters going forward, too, is ISIS is essentially a Sunni Arab force. The United States has to work by, through, and with Sunni Arabs to be able to pacify Sunni Arab areas. The Kurds can only really go so far in Syria. So the answer, I think, in the future, too, is going to be how does the United States work with Sunni Arabs in the region to help pacify these areas, build them in, show them that they have a future in governance and aren't just going to be left at the mercies of other ISIS on the one hand or Iran and other Shia militias on the other. We didn't take that path. President Trump inherited that policy from President Obama, and now we have huge problems with the Turks as a result.
Yeah. ISIS, the fight against ISIS, consumed NATO to a great extent. That fight is, to a great extent, over now. What's the biggest focus now, or what should it be for NATO?
Well, I think the biggest focus for NATO has to be really twofold. One is territorial defense. It begins there. That is, how do you defend Europe from any revisionist actor, be it the Russians in the northern kind of European theater, be it Iranian terrorism in Europe itself. We've seen terrorist attacks in Denmark, outside of Paris in the past several months and years. I think these sorts of things have to be kind of a combined, unified position of Europe and the United States. There are out-of-area operations, Afghanistan and Iraq, that matter a great deal. We're training up new troops is a focus of the United States and Europe. So I think there's enough challenges for NATO to focus on going forward. I don't think those are going away. The real challenge is politically keeping the momentum alive to work together on these issues, because I think publics in the United States are growing wary. I think Europeans are growing wary of this president. And it really is hard work to keep showing people why NATO matters and why it's an important alliance.
Is NATO dying, like your colleague said, do you think?
I don't think NATO is necessarily dying, but it needs to be repurposed. It needs to be really outfitted for the next few decades of the 21st century. Ironically, I think the person who probably is most responsible for NATO being in existence today is Vladimir Putin. If it weren't for Vladimir Putin and his meddling in Eastern Europe, who knows what the European attitude would be towards NATO, and who knows whether or not the United States would still have the interest in being actively involved in European affairs. It's unclear. So I think Vladimir Putin probably is officer number one, so to speak, in rallying Europe together to keep NATO alive and to keep it functional in the coming decades.
Yeah, but with the way things stand, with growing reluctance in the United States, even in some countries in Europe, the lack of increase in defense spendings in some countries, the way it stands, can this be maintained as an alliance, as a well-functioning alliance? Or would it start disintegrating if there's no change?
There are trends that hint at the disintegration of NATO, there's no doubt. If the United States pivots towards the Asia-Pacific, Europe becomes this postmodern paradise that doesn't believe in hard power. It's easy to imagine the United States working together on a bilateral basis with, say, Eastern European partners who believe in nationalism, who believe in kind of religion, who believe in power projection, these traditional American values, and NATO as a result beginning to crumble. The big question, I think, for NATO in the future is that at the heart of Europe is one power, Germany, that has pacifism woven through its DNA. And the question is, how do the Germans respond to the challenges of today and tomorrow? If they're unable to muster the strength to invest more in military defense, it's hard to imagine the American public sustaining NATO for the coming decades.
The Germans need some gen therapy.
Yeah, so to speak, I suppose, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.